Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do a weekly book review. This week, I read Do I Make Myself Clear? Why Writing Well Matters by Harold Evans. Released in 2017, this is honestly a high school English lesson that we all should have heeded years ago. It gives you real-world examples of the manipulation of language and thought, but ultimately enforcing the importance of comprehension for effective communication, specifically written communication, obviously. Now, Harold Evans, by his own account, has spent his life editing thousands of writers, so he can write this book. But also he wrote a manual for journalists, which was adopted by the Society of Editors and the Asian Press. So this is someone who clearly has the credentials to give us, advice on how to write well. But if you don't believe him, you only have to read a few chapters in to recognize the amount of research as well as references that he has pulled into this book in order to prove that writing well does matter, and it helps you get your point across a lot easier and a lot sooner. So, it wouldn't be a writing book if I didn't talk about the structure of it. So we do get an introduction, and if you're one of those people who you're in the store, you pick up a book, you read the first couple of pages to see if you like it, you're going to find in this book that it tells you exactly why you need to read it, because it helps you decipher the fog online, the fog in print, the fog throughout Wall Street, the fog in regulating agencies, insurance agencies, contracts, academia, U.S. Supreme Court decisions, regulations, things like the Affordable Care Act, etc. What this shows us is that language, verbiage, words, however you want to put it, they ultimately dictate how all of us live. So you really should understand, what a law is, how it's being written, who wrote it, what was the purpose of it, so that when we're all held to this standard, if you decide to sue someone or something like that, you know what you're up against, you know what you were supposed to do, by paper. So I think it's important for us to recognize that even if you're not a writer, a lot of the people that were referenced in this book are not writers. People like politicians or lawyers that purposely sometimes write in things to be ambiguous or, however it may be, to protect their interest. So it's imperative, in my opinion, that everyone recognizes good writing or writing that is intentionally to deceive you. And for the writers, obviously this can help you, but I think this has far greater, I don't want to say real world implications because writers are in the real world, but this can certainly help you in your everyday life. Now we have 3 parts. The first part takes up about the first half of the book, and that is because it's telling you how to stop writing like you're trying to reach the page limit or the word count on a research paper. I know most of us have been there before. You're trying to, for example, write in with the exception of, instead of just writing except. A lot of us do it. I know I started that habit in school when I was trying to reach a certain, page limit, whatever, but we're not in school anymore. You don't need to write emails like that. Let's get straight to the point. There's not really a lot to be gained by making something longer, especially in the age of social media when we find that people really don't pay attention that long anyway. So when it comes to things like, something as simple as professional emails, it doesn't need to be 5 pages long. Okay? That's just my pet peeve. I really can't stand it. Like, let's get to the point. What do you want? What do you need from me? And what do I need to do? Okay? But along with this, we get a foundation in writing. So it's a lot of discussion, including terms such as adverbs, verbs, subjects, objects, modifiers, adjectives, predatory language, passive voice, active voice. And this kind of makes the first half drag along. I'm not going to lie, because it's kind of setting, the standard. This is what, we all learned in high school, and this is how we're going to use this information to make better sounding writing pieces. But it was funny because it was like, oh, now all of a sudden we're talking about adjectives, and I thought this was over in like third grade, but here we are. Now, part 2 gives us a lot of examples, examples of perfect narratives, as well as some rewrites and explanations on why certain speeches or, pieces went well and why they didn't. Whereas part 3 gives us some of the best examples and some of the worst of the worst. And that is because I specifically remember reading, I think it had something to do with Social Security, and just reading that regulation out. I don't understand how people do it. Like, it makes no sense to me, because the language, first of all, it's like we don't speak that way, in everyday life. So it's hard enough to try to pinpoint what they're referring to, but to read like pages and pages of that, it gives you a headache. So that's what I mean by worst of the worst. It's something that's so important and affects so many people, but yet so few of us are able to actually understand what is being said. But then we also get examples of some of the greatest speeches of all time. And we get commentary from Evans, which is probably the best part, because you're able to look at exactly what he pulled out. Sometimes he italicizes specific words to show you that they aren't really necessary, or something that made the speech stick, and all that good stuff. Now, halfway through the book, after part 1, we do get an interlude, which it was kind of funny. It was only 2 pages long, but apparently it was Shakespeare and not Soulja Boy who invented language, and that's according to Bernard Levin. And I'm so sorry for anyone that doesn't understand that reference, because that's one of my personal references. But really, the interlude was just explaining how a lot of the phrases that we use today can all be traced back to Shakespeare. And I didn't really know that. I'm trying to kind of get my Shakespeare collection back up, because I remember, reading the select plays in school. But that's one good thing about secondhand bookshops. The classics are really, really cheap. I just bought, I think, it was a collection of like 4 of Shakespeare's plays, and I want to say it was like $2 or $3. So that was awesome. But I'm slowly building up my Shakespeare collection again. So hopefully I'll understand where half of our references in society today come from soon. Now, we also get an afterthought, which obviously is just a thought or something that he wrote after the book was already completed, maybe months down the line, maybe years, And then we get further analysis of the underwear bomber, and that comes from chapter 9. And we get an example of both the coverage as well as the reports on that specific bombing incident or attempted bombing incident. And he dives deeper into it in the analysis, which is cool because, again, these are real world experiences. These are events that already happened. And looking at how they were covered or how they were investigated, it really shows you how it can sway the court of public opinion. And now, looking back on these incidents with retrospect, we can see, we can pinpoint where it either mobilized or immobilized a group of people or the country or whatever. Now, I really enjoyed this book mainly for the tone. Evans has kind of like a playful tone, very informal. He pokes fun at the terrible writings just as much as I did when I was reading it, literally out loud to myself. I'm like, this is ridiculous. So I like that he's kind of putting himself on that same level of us, where there's a lot of verbiage that he doesn't understand in the regulations and laws and things like that. And it's important that the tone is informal like that, because his goal is really to teach and not to berate us. If this was written by an author that had a condescending attitude, even though, I came to read this book to learn something, I'm not going to continue reading it if the author is, sounds like a butthead. But he does also include calls to action, and that is by way of inviting the audience to analyze examples themselves and then come back and compare it to his notes. Also, there's the man or the machine exercise where you're given 4 writing pieces. I want to say they were pieces of a whole paper, but you can decide whether or not it was written by a computer or an actual person and what the implications of that are. And he goes into a further not like a further analysis, but he gives you the answers at the end of the book as well. This is all just engaging the audience. Obviously the topic of writing is not very fun, and this is not like one of those fiction reads where you have somebody to root for. There's not really a story here. It's just information. So that definitely kept up my energy throughout the book. He also is very repetitive in what he is teaching and what he's trying to get across. There are so many different examples where he'll give you the paragraph or the sentence, and like it almost seems like word by word he'll tell you why this word isn't necessary. He'll rewrite it. He'll rewrite it again and again. And it gets a little annoying, but again, this is just to enforce his teachings and his observations. And for people like me who just give me an example of what should be done and maybe give me an example of what should not be done. And then that way, when I'm working through it myself, I can kind of judge where I am on that scale and go from there and learn from there. So I did enjoy the examples. He gives you a lot, so just FYI. Now, he also references people, obviously, bringing in the examples. He utilizes other authors' works. This includes speeches, contracts, reports, quotes, tweets, a lot of different things. Some of those examples are FDR's speech after Pearl Harbor, Bret Stephens' coverage of Trump and his campaign for presidency, a bunch of federal regulations, as well as different reporters like Michael Daly, who does news coverage. So these are just a few of the examples. There's a lot in there, a lot of good speeches and quotes and stories and coverages of a lot of different events that impacted society as a whole. And he breaks down the importance of, the writing in those pieces. Some of them acted as examples of terrible written communication. Some acted as backup information for an argument. And some of them just summed up the book's entire message. This particular story is why writing well matters. It painted the story perfectly. It conveyed what it was supposed to, all that junk. He also brings in his personal experience a lot. One thing that stuck with me was the story where him and his friends learned how to ski. So Evans and his friends went to this skiing resort, and they were given a manual, like an instructional manual on how to ski. Now, because it wasn't written with average people in mind, they weren't able to learn solely from that. And so after trying skiing, just, after reading the pamphlet, they failed. And after they were able to learn from someone else, they actually went back and rewrote the manual and named it We Learned to Ski. And so it's funny how even something as simple as that, sometimes I think professionals and people who are experts in their field have to take a step back and recognize that for the majority of your audience, they're not going to really be in your world day to day. So like politicians, we have to keep in mind that we want this information to reach the masses. And how do we do that? We have to keep in mind that it has to have a certain level of understanding, people have to be able to read it. So including a bunch of ski terms that non-skiers wouldn't know is not helpful for someone who is a beginner in that sport. Now, if you're like me, every time I see a book mentioned by an author in a book that I'm reading, I put it on my to be read list. So a couple that I found in here were The Elements of Eloquence by Mark Forsyth and The Art of Readable Writing by Rudolph Flesch. So if anyone's interested in reading further about writing, I would start there. That's how I get most of my recommendations, by, looking at what other authors hold as like their holy grail, and then go from there. All right, it's theme time. Now, obviously, all of these themes are going to fall under the umbrella of comprehension. You know, how to write well. How do we get that perfect piece of writing? Well, first, it needs to be readable. So, readability is something that comes up a lot during this book in ways that maybe you wouldn't really necessarily think of. For example, sentence structure. The length of your sentence matters. If it is too long, it's going to put people off. It's going to confuse them. If you have a lot of syllables, sometimes that's not really necessary. So what's the level of difficulty here? I think the most important question after that would be, who's your audience? You know, there are a few formulas as well as a few indices where, and I'm sure today there's like websites and things like that can calculate this information for you, where you can determine what level of what grade level of reading or age range is your paper going to reach more. Like what's the highest group that can read this paper? If you're writing a kid's book and your writing is scoring in the college age range, you need to really reevaluate how you're doing things and go back and make some edits, because you want to write so that your audience is able to read it well. And this sounds really simple and redundant, but obviously everyone doesn't do it if someone had to write a book about it. And if you just look on social media, you know, everyone does not have comprehension skills. So let's not make it harder on them. Let's try to make your paper, your book, as readable as possible. That's not to say to strip your work down to the bare minimum, but keep in mind that including too many words, sometimes including too many adjectives, it's too much. Just break it down to what will get the point across and go from there. Now, some of those indices include the Flesch Reading Ease Index, the Flesch Kincaid Grade Level, the Dale-Chow Formula, the Gunning-Fogg Index. Now, obviously, these formulas, they are rating tools and they're not writing tools. So good writing is something that you'll know when you see it. But this is kind of a good way to start. If you're unsure about who you are as a writer, what your writing style is, maybe you can plug in a paragraph or a page or, 20, 30 pages or two or something into one of these things and see who you're going to reach as of right now and go from there. I wouldn't get like too crazy with this though. I know I'm probably one of the people that like would overdo it, and I would be like constantly checking it, but I don't think you should let it get in the way of your creative process. Or if you're writing something emotional, it's not really going to pick up on that in an index. It's just going to look at literally like how many letters, how many words, how many syllables, things like that. But I do think it's worth checking every now and then to make sure that your work is even readable to your audience. Now, along with that includes revisions. Blaise Pascal, who Evans referenced in the book, said, "I would have written something shorter, but I didn't have time." I think that, first of all, that statement is very true. It takes longer to shorten your, sentence, but keeping the necessary information in it. And oftentimes I will find myself doing this in emails at work. Like I'll write out something and I'll write it kind of like I'm having a conversation with this person, but emails come across different. We all know that. So I'll write something out and then I'll go back, I'll take out all the unnecessary stuff. And nowadays I think like Outlook, Gmail, they'll suggest taking out words that are unnecessary anyway. But it does take time to kind of look back, see what doesn't really need to be there, take it out, and go from there. I think as you do it more and more, it'll become, innate for you to do that. But self-editing is the road to success and the road to excellence. You really should look at what you're writing and read it before you put it out there. For Twitter, for Facebook, whatever it is, if you're trying to make a point and something's spelled wrong or you're missing a word, no one's going to take you seriously and they're going to stop reading right there. So if anything, just do it for your pride. If you're worried about being humbled, Ernest Hemingway rewrote 49 different last pages to Farewell to Arms. Barbara Tuchman wrote 18 different introductions to the Guns of August. So the greats do it. Why can't you? Revise, okay? You need to go back and edit the things that you are writing so that you don't sound incompetent or you don't lose your audience. Now, along with being readable, your work needs to be effective. So what's the point of your writing piece? Are you informing people? Are you persuading people? Are you mobilizing or immobilizing an audience? Evans said, I discovered early on how skilled some people in politics and business are in using words not for communicating ideas, but concealing them. This is a point I think that's great for the reader, someone who is taking in information. If you're reading something that has really no point, or it sounds like it's going round and around, I think that's when you need to start side-eyeing things. Typically, that indicates deception, or they're trying to kind of shy away from something, or they're trying to distance themselves from something. You know, a lot of times you'll find that type of talk in contracts. Lawyers are, hired and paid to write things so that whoever their client is protected. Insurance stuff, whatever. So just take that in mind and just read things kind of actively. But if something's not making sense, then you really need to look at that situation a little bit harder. Now, one example that I really enjoyed was Evans' take on Trump's campaign. And he said that essentially Trump was very effective mainly because of his repetitive assertions and his insistent certainty. So again, that's getting straight to the point. And he would say, over and over again, that was something that his campaign believed in, his supporters believed in, and he was straight to the point. He cut out all the fluff. I've heard that tons of times. That's what people like about him, is that he gets straight to the point. And when you really look at the culture of language, it makes sense. So now, obviously, the intention of this book was to get people to understand that, one, writing matters, writing well matters, and two, give them some instruction on how to do that. Help the readers to say what they want to say concisely, without without ambiguity, and without being put off by the mandarins fussing about proper English. Now, in my opinion, I do think that Evans wrote this book well. However, the audience must be willing to be the student again. You're going to get a lot of information that sometimes may seem beneath you, like talking about the use of an adjective and the overuse of an adjective. But, part of that is just acknowledging that half of us have issues with comprehension, again, on social media, through professional emails, even through conversation. We don't need to, a 30-minute conversation can really, a lot of the times, be dwindled down to 5. What do you need from me? What can I do? And let's go on about our day. Let's be very effective with our communication, because, we all have a lot of things to do in life, and I just do not choose to spend my time around people who talk for 30 minutes about nothing. I can't. Especially when that one bit of information, it's like, takes them 30 seconds to spit out. Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to, if you're okay with getting through the first half of the book with all of that information and all of those examples, you will certainly learn something, and you will learn how to write well from this book. But I think that the reception is interesting because looking online, the reviews were kind of like average, like 4 out of 5. But what I found upon doing further research is that people either really like the book or really dislike the book. And that is because some of the negative responses were that there were too many examples. Again, repetition. Some people thought it wasn't very clear. I could see that as well because there's a lot of information here. But you know what? What it really comes down to is the fact that the people who really need this probably won't read a book anyway. And so I think that sometimes people will probably pick this book up and expecting it to be a fun, you know, a fun book about writing. I mean, I had fun reading it and I enjoy writing and reading, but at times it was really monotonous to get through. And it's certainly not something that you sit down and you read, even for 1 week. I think this is something that you need to spread out. Honestly, I think he should have separated it into 3 books. So the 3 parts I thought could have been book 1, book 2, book 3. But there's no real point in that other than just separating it for sanity's sake. But it does answer the question, but it doesn't tell you why writing matters, why writing well matters. It gives you examples. It displays that information for you. So it's more of a how-to. And it's more of a reference. It's certainly something that I'll reference. I will probably never again read the entire thing. But I'll go back and time and time again. There's good information in here. He has a good word glossary as well as, how-tos on, all types of stuff. So this is certainly something for the writer, obviously, but someone who wants to freshen their written communication skills. This is really necessary, I think, for a lot of people, but everyone's not going to like it. So that's fine. As far as me, again, I would reread it, not all at once. I think it was 5 out of 5 for informative and all of the stuff it taught me and reinforced for me. But overall, I would probably say a C. And it's not because it's a bad book, but just it was a lot at times. It was a lot. But the key takeaway here is take care with what you write and how you write it, and take time to assess what you're reading. And that's all. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. I know I was a day late, but it's partly because this book was a little bit more involved than I thought. But I will see you guys next week. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and thank you so much.